Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 17. The Lord your God is with you, the mighty warrior who saves. He will take great delight in you. In his love he will no longer rebuke you, but will rejoice over you with singing. In our fourth part of our lecture on the somatosensory pathways, we will be learning about the pathway for discriminative touch, which includes vibration and pressure. Abbreviations in this part of the lecture include DRG for dorsal root ganglion, VPL, ventral posterolateral, and C for cervical. Greek letters in this part of our lecture include the letter beta. A reminder that there are several different receptors for discriminative touch, some of which are free nerve endings and some of which are encapsulated. They include the hair follicle receptors, Ruffini endings, Merkel's complex, Meissner's corpuscles, and Pacinian corpuscles. Unlike the pain and temperature pathway that uses a single tract through the spinal cord and the brainstem in order to get to the thalamus, the discriminative touch pathway is a two-track system. It uses one tract in the spinal cord and a second tract in the brainstem. This system is named for the two tracts and is known as the dorsal column medial lemniscus system. Also, unlike pain and temperature, that uses an A delta or C neuron for its first order afferent, the discriminative touch pathway uses a larger and more heavily myelinated neuron, an A beta first order afferent. The tract carrying discriminative touch information in the spinal cord is the dorsal column. In reality, the dorsal column consists of two parallel fasciculi. You'll recall that a fasciculus is pretty much analogous to a tract. But because these two fasciculi are seldomly referenced in a clinical setting, and you will unlikely ever need to use them, I am not going to have you know their names. Instead, we're just going to talk about the dorsal column and consider it as if it were one single tract. The dorsal column is positioned posteromedially in the spinal cord. Once the discriminative touch information ascends up into the brainstem and reaches the medulla, the information will be transferred to a second tract. This tract is known as the medial lemniscus. The medial lemniscus is positioned anteromedially in the medulla and the caudal aspect of the pons. However, as it ascends up through the rostral pons and into the midbrain, it moves progressively more laterally, so that by the time it is within the midbrain itself, it is positioned in a lateral position, just anterior to our spinothalamic tract. The types of information that are carried in the discriminative touch pathway include vibration, pressure, texture, skin stretch, hair movement, shapes and edges, etc. Information from the lower part of the trunk and the legs is going to travel most medially in the dorsal column, with information coming from the sacral spinal segments being the most medial. Information from the upper extremities is going to travel laterally in the dorsal column, with the upper cervical levels being the most lateral. Here's an image that you saw in a previous part of this week's lectures showing you a typical spinal cord segment. In the back, we can see that dorsal column. And you can see how most medially is represented are sacral neurons, then lumbar, then thoracic, and then cervical. This makes sense since sensory information is entering into that dorsal column in order to ascend. We need to have the cervicals be the most lateral. Otherwise, cervical information would have to cross through and make its way through the other levels to get medial. I like to think of this as being if you go to church and you go to sit down in a pew. If there are several people there before you, hopefully they have moved in towards the center of the pew so that you can easily just slip into the pew near the aisle. Otherwise, if they are sitting next to the aisle but there's a space in the center, you have to kind of work your way through and hopefully not stick your backside into somebody's, face or shoulder or step on a foot as you're trying to work your way in to get to the open seats in the center. So God was very smart. He designed it so that the first neurons in from the sacral level that have to travel all the way up the full length of the spinal cord, that they travel up the most medially, so that as we work our way up the spinal cord, then the other neurons can just easily file into place. Looking by the ventral horn, we can see our anterolateral system that we talked about in the previous parts of the lecture, where our primary pain pathway and our temperature pathways travel. Now let's go ahead and draw in the discriminative touch pathway. Here we have our first order afferent. I chose Meissner's corpuscle. You could select any of the discriminative touch receptors. We have our A beta first order afferent, cell body situated in the dorsal root ganglion. But you can see how the central axon doesn't go into the dorsal horn, but instead enters the dorsal column. Again, if this were coming from your foot, that would be, or your buttock, we would be more medial. If we're coming more from the upper extremity or from the neck region, we're going to be more lateral. But it enters the dorsal column and then it ascends up to the brainstem. Let's now take the discriminative touch pathway step by step. A discriminative touch receptor is stimulated, triggering the opening of modality-gated ion channels and the formation of receptor potentials. If we have sufficient summation, an action potential is generated in the first order afferent, propagating along the A beta first order neuron. The cell body of this pseudounipolar neuron will be in a dorsal root ganglion. The central axon of the pseudounipolar neuron enters the spinal cord and travels up in the dorsal column to the caudal medulla. When the central axon of the first order A beta afferent reaches the caudal medulla, it synapses with a second order neuron in a nucleus located in the posteromedial aspect of the caudal medulla. Like the two fasciculi within the dorsal column, I am not going to have you know the name of the nucleus. The axon of the second order neuron will cross to the contralateral side of the medulla and enter the medial lemniscus, which is located on the anteromedial aspect of the medulla. Here it will take the medial lemniscus up to the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. The second order neuron synapses with a third order neuron in the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. The axon of the third order neuron takes the posterior limb of the internal capsule and the corona radiata to the primary somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. Once the information reaches the primary somatosensory cortex, conscious perception of discriminative touch takes place. Let's draw in our complete pathway. And here you can see the complete pathway. Now I'm going to pull up a pointer. Here I have selected a Meissner's corpuscle for my discriminative touch receptor. You can select any receptor that you like as long as it's consistent with the area of body that you have indicated. My Meissner's corpuscle is going to be on the palmar aspect of the distal thumb. It will have an A beta first order afferent, and because the median nerve innervates the skin of the distal thumb, this afferent will be traveling in the median nerve. It's going to have its cell body in the dorsal root ganglion, and then it's going to enter the C6 level of the spinal cord, because C6 is what innervates this area of the thumb based upon my dermatomes. Instead of entering the dorsal horn as our prior pathways have done, this pathway is going to enter the dorsal column. But it's not going to synapse in the dorsal column. Instead, the central axon of our first order afferent is going to ascend in the dorsal column all the way up to the caudal medulla. When it gets to the caudal medulla, it's going to synapse in a nucleus there. That nucleus will be located posteriorly and medially in this caudal medulla. It's going to synapse on the second order neuron. The second order neuron is going to cross to the other side. It's now anteromedial. It's not only cross sides, but it went from back to front. It's going to ascend in a tract called the medial lemniscus, so my second order neuron remains medial and travels in the medial lemniscus all the way through the brainstem. Gets a little more lateral once we get to the midbrain, because it's got to head over here to the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. There it's going to synapse on the third order neuron, which travels over to the lateral aspect of the primary somatosensory cortex and terminates the pathway there. Again, continuing to note how sensation from the right side of the body ends up on the left side of the brain. So now I've got some brainstorm questions for you. What happens to the sensations on one side of the body if we have an injury to the peripheral nerve? What happens to the sensations on one side of the body if we have an injury to one side of the spinal cord? What happens to the sensations on one side of the body if we have an injury on one side of the brainstem? And what happens to the sensations on one side of the body if we have an injury to one of the cerebral hemispheres? I want you to talk about this online and help each other to figure out how you would know what the answers would be. Just to do a little bit of brainstorming and get you started, let's add in some injuries. This is our discriminative touch pathway that you just saw, but now I'm going to add in some injuries. Here's my injury to the peripheral nerve. What happens to discriminative touch on the right side of the body? What about on the left side of the body? Now I've damaged the spinal cord. What happens if I've damaged one side of the spinal cord? What happens to sensation on the right side of the body versus the left? Now I've damaged the left side of my brainstem. What's happening to sensation on the right side of my body versus the left side of my body? And now the cerebrum. You want to do this for each of your tracks that we've talked about so far, so that you can get a good sense of what information is going to be impacted by injuries at different locations within the pathway.